All right, well, thanks, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. If you'll take your seats, we'll begin. Welcome to the Johnson Center, the Hoover Institution's outpost in Washington, D.C. My name's Adam White. I'm a research fellow here at the institution. It's my pleasure to welcome you all today and to welcome our guests. Last autumn, Senator Mike Lee took to the floor of the United States Senate and delivered a remarkable speech on religion and the American founding. He began, "I've been doing a lot of thinking lately about the fascinating men and women of America's founding generation. I want to share with you one of their stories." He proceeded to tell the story of Jonas Phillips, a remarkable man who had arrived in the United States, a penniless Jewish immigrant, and who went on to become an American patriot and war hero. And then he became an advocate for religious liberty under the new Constitution, particularly in terms of his opposition to religious tests for office. As it happens, Mr. Phillips' life had been on the mind of Rabbi Meir Soloveichik, too. A few months earlier, Rabbi Soloveichik had reflected on church and state in a talk here at Hoover. As it happens, he stopped here en route to Monticello to honor Jonas Phillips' descendants who bought Jefferson's home in 1839 and thus saved from ruin this treasured piece of America's heritage. Given the attention that Senator Lee and Rabbi Soloveichik have dedicated to these fundamental American principles and the importance of those issues in our own time, we're so glad that they could join us both today to continue this discussion of religion and the American founding. So very briefly, let me introduce them. Mike Lee is a United States Senator from the state of Utah, one of Congress's foremost constitutionalists. He previously served as an assistant U.S. attorney and as a clerk for Justice Samuel Alito, and I'll add, he's the son of the late Rex Lee, one of the real legends in modern American constitutionalism, former Solicitor General of the United States. Meir Soloveichik is rabbi of the Congregation Shereth Israel in New York City and director of the Strauss Center for Torah and Western Thought at Yeshiva University. He writes a monthly column for Commentary, and he writes often for the Wall Street Journal, Mosaic, and other publications. It's my honor and pleasure to welcome you both here today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So let's begin. Senator Lee, I have to ask for the outset, what spurred you to give that remarkable speech last fall, and have you continued to think about these basic themes of the founding, religion, and religious tests for office?
We were at an inflection point in the Senate when I saw a couple of questions being presented to presidential nominees submitted to the Senate for confirmation, questions that I thought smacked of a religious test. And I found it troubling, deeply troubling, that people were being asked about their religious beliefs by senators as they went through committee confirmation processes, as if particulars of their religious beliefs would somehow be relevant to the post that they'd both been asked to occupy. It bothered me greatly, and so I decided I needed to speak on it, not for the purpose of condemning any one colleague, because, you know, from time to time, it's easy for people to neglect the bigger picture as they go through the daily grind of the work of the Senate, and particularly as they get drawn into sometimes thorny political discussions. But I did want to remind my colleagues about our rich tradition of religious history in America, and that's where the story of Jonas Phillips seemed to feature in so well. The fact that this was an immigrant to America who came over in the mid-1700s from what we would today call Germany, and he was Jewish. He became a successful merchant. He also fought in the Revolutionary War. During the period of the Revolution, he continued to correspond with people in Europe with notes written in Yiddish so as to avoid the blockade being imposed by the British Navy. It turns out the king's military personnel weren't so good at Yiddish, and so as a result of that, he was able to correspond without having those intercepted. Jonas Phillips became aware after the Revolution of the fact that a couple of states had started to impose a type of religious test on some of the people who would serve in their state governments, and this bothered him. So he wrote a letter to George Washington, who was presiding over the Constitutional Convention that summer in Philadelphia in 1787, saying it's really wrong for these states to require that anyone holding office under state government take an oath or express allegiance to a belief in the New Testament as the Word of God, because this would explicitly exclude Jewish Americans like me. And as it turned out, at almost exactly the same time that Washington received this, they had already introduced and adopted the prohibition against religious tests. Jonas Phillips was prescient in his concerns for that, and I think his legacy stands today as one that we need to remember and we need to honor.
I want to come back to the specific debate that spurred your talk, but if I may, Rabbi Soloveitchik, would you mind continuing the story of the Phillips family? When you were here in, I think, May of last year, you just written a Wall Street Journal op-ed called the Jews Who Saved Monticello.
Yeah.
Right, so what happens with Phillips's family?
So it's really amazing, and I was so struck by Senator Lee's incredible speech, because I've been going around speaking about Jonas Phillips and calling him the most important American Jew that you've never heard of. And all of a sudden, a senator gets up in the United States Senate and says, I'm going to tell you about a Jew named Jonas Phillips. There was a little part of me, the rabbinic competitive aspect, which was, thinking, that's my thing. I talk about Jonas Phillips. But actually, to think about a man, a Jew who arrives as an immigrant to the colonies, who fights for removing religious tests for office, is now being celebrated by a senator in the Senate of the United States is an incredible thing. Now, it's precisely at that year, 1787, that Benjamin Rush, who was one of the founders, a very good friend of both Adams and Jefferson, at around the same time that Phillips is writing this letter, he attends a wedding of Jonas Phillips's daughter in Jonas Phillips's home. And that itself testifies to the freedom and the comfort in society that Jews found in America, because that could not have happened elsewhere. That you're inviting one of the most famous men in your country, to second most famous man in Philadelphia at the time, Benjamin Rush, after Franklin, to the wedding. He comes to the wedding, he writes to his wife describing this Jewish wedding with really great feeling and great philo-Semitism. And then the child born to this couple, whose wedding Benjamin Rush attended, went on to be a Jewish naval war hero by the name of Uriah Phillips Levy. And Jefferson was his hero, so he bought Jefferson's estate. When it lay in ruin, Jefferson died bankrupt, spent a lot of money on French wine and other things like that. And he went around buying back all of the different objects of the estate that had been sold and restored the estate. And ultimately, his family, his nephew, then gave the estate to the American people.
And members of the Phillips family, they now lay and rest on the grounds of Monticello, right?
So Jonas Phillips's daughter is buried at Monticello, and I took members of my community to visit that grave and to say a Jewish memorial prayer for Jonas Phillips. And Jonas Phillips is buried in our original cemetery, which is now in the middle of Chinatown in Manhattan. And the week before Memorial Day, we plant flags at the graves of all of our members who fought in the American Revolution. I don't think that's something a lot of synagogues in America are able to do. And I always reserve for myself the privilege of planting a flag, either myself or my children, at the grave of Jonas Phillips.
And I should have added this when I introduced you. Your synagogue is it the oldest in the United
Yes,
States?
we are the oldest congregation in America. We don't like to talk about it except every day.
Right.
And it's a very moving ceremony. And I love planting that flag at Phillips's grave.
Well, obviously, I recommend both Senator Lee's speech and Rabbi Soloveitchik's writings on this. But if we can take a step back and look at the big picture, and obviously too big a question to ever be answered in a half hour or an hour, or let alone a semester or a year, but taking the lessons from the founders and from Jonas Phillips and all the others, how should we understand the relationship between religion and the American founding and America today? It's such a simple question.
For me, the relationship you described is inextricably intertwined with the religious belief that so many people in this country have. In other words, the lessons that we learned during the founding generation, what occurred during the American Revolution, was the natural outgrowth of a belief in a higher being, Specifically, I refer to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Regardless of the specific name by which we know him, it is the same God, and that God believes that his sons and daughters have inestimable worth, have eternal value, and consequently, no man, no woman should be in bondage one to another. When you believe in the inherent dignity of the human soul, that does something to your belief about how government should operate, and that does something to your belief about restricting the power of government so that it can't intrude on the liberty of the individual. We believe that not just because words like liberty and freedom sound great when you use them in a speech, but because we believe of the wonderful things that free people will do when they are allowed to be free. They will, among other things, study and learn about their own religion. They will ponder about their place in the universe, about how they can build a better world for today and for tomorrow, for their children and their children's children, and also about broader questions like justice, about how we can produce a world that is more kind and benevolent. And so I think that has been key to our success as a constitutional republic. It's one of the reasons why, as countless scholars have questioned the reasons behind the differential outcomes in the American Revolution on the one hand and the French Revolution on the other. I think a critical difference had to do with the type of religious belief that was found on this continent at that time and that remains here today.
Rabbi?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. We often miss, actually, how revolutionary this notion of no religious test for office is. And it was that for the Jews of my community originally, rather than the First Amendment, which was meant originally just to limit the national government. It was that clause in the Constitution that made America so incredible to them. So to give two contrasts, in Britain, even incredibly successful and wealthy Jews like the Rothschilds were not allowed to be seated in Parliament until the late 1850s, early 1860s, and that was after a huge debate. And then in France, which the senator rightly referenced, so after the Revolution, when they discussed the rights of Jews in France, Clermont-Tonnerre, speaking in the French Assembly, and this was the progressive liberal approach to things, he said, we'll give them everything as Frenchmen, but not as Jews. In other words, they can't bring their Jewish identity into the public square. So France sets up a very different approach to religious liberty than the Americans. So America, at this moment, is actually teaching the world an entirely new approach to religious freedom, one which lay at the heart of American identity from its original founding.
I mean, that's something that was so striking for me, the experience last fall with that particular nomination, and then your speech was a reminder that, you know, while we tend to think of religious liberty in terms of the First Amendment, right? What you were speaking about, what people were writing about, was something that precedes the First Amendment, right? From Article 6, no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States. And so I thought it was interesting to look beyond that subsequent First Amendment, to look back into that, and then, of course, into the structure of the Constitution, the idea of the checks and balances, something that Justice Scalia wrote about in his famous Smith case. The checks and balances and republicanism and federalism were expected to be bulwarks of this religious liberty just as much as the First Amendment would be, right? So,
yeah, if I could speak to that, I'm a huge Nino Scalia fan, and we marked, I believe it was yesterday, the 2-year anniversary of his passing. I still remember exactly where I was when I learned of it. I was doing a town hall in Hurricane, Utah. Yes, it is pronounced hurricane rather than hurricane, like it's spelled. Was very saddened when that happened, in part because I heard him give a number of speeches over the years. in which he referenced something very profound, something that has influenced me as a lawmaker and as a citizen, where he said, I love the Bill of Rights. The American Bill of Rights is a wonderful thing. It provides protections for the American people. But, he warned, any tin-horn dictator around the world can have a Bill of Rights. And a lot of tin-horn dictators in power today have a Bill of Rights, one that you could stack up against ours and say, yeah, they look comparable. In some cases, the tin-horn dictator's Bill of Rights might even look more protective than ours. But what separates the republic, where rights are respected, where the dignity of the human soul is not in danger, from the regime in which people's rights are trampled and individuals are discarded as if they were the daily refuse, is the structural component of our Constitution, the fact that we separate power in our system on two axes. We provide for a separation on the vertical axis with something we call federalism, making sure that most of the power stays close to the people and only a few powers are exercised nationally. And we separated it out horizontally through separation of powers between the three branches of the federal government, making sure that no one can achieve too much power. It's only when we do that that we breathe life into, we give meaning to, we put force behind the thou shalt nots of the Bill of Rights. And I think we should never lose sight of that. Those of us who believe in religious liberty and liberty of every other kind, whether enumerated in the Bill of Rights or not, would be well advised to protect and defend federalism and separation of powers as vigorously as any other single substantive protection in the Constitution.
So surveying the scene today, both in terms of government and in terms of society in the public square, what areas do you think, most call out for reform in the way we think about the relationship between religion and religious belief and believers and government? I mean, is there any, we've already talked about the appointments issue and religious tests a little bit, but are there other areas where you think we've gone a bit afield from the framers' original vision of this relationship between faith and government?
The big picture level, I think it's a mistake to view the Establishment Clause as doing more than it actually did. The Establishment Clause was put in place. I discussed this in a book I wrote a few years ago called Our Lost Constitution. All 12 people who read Our Lost Constitution really enjoyed it.
I'm looking forward to the movie.
Yes. The movie and the TV series after that on Netflix, I'm sure. I devote a chapter of Our Lost Constitution to explaining the Establishment Clause and its origins and the fact that it was put in place specifically to keep Congress out of the realm of designating a national church, in part because the states wanted to retain that right for themselves, so that if Maryland wanted to be a Catholic state, it could. Now, over the course of time, every single state that had previously established a state church decided that that was a bad idea. And I'll be the first one to say I agree with them. It is a bad idea. I don't think having a state church is a good idea. But the purpose behind the Establishment Clause was always to say that Congress may not establish a national church. It said nothing about what a state could do. It certainly said nothing about the particulars of whether a state-run school could ever mention the word God or allow students to pray in public. It certainly said nothing about whether a state could place a cross at the site of a fallen state trooper to honor his or her sacrifice for public safety. And so the whole point of that chapter of my book is to point out that our modern Establishment Clause jurisprudence was based on a fraud, and it was put forward by a bigoted member of the United States Supreme Court, Hugo Black, who was himself a former member of the Ku Klux Klan, who fought aggressively to limit the influence of the Catholic Church in America's education system. I don't know whether there's anything going back, whether it's realistic to assume that the Supreme Court will go back on that, but the history is not with this hyper-aggressive interpretation of the Establishment Clause. It is quite to the contrary. It's quite the opposite of what the Establishment Clause was put in place to do, which was to stop Congress from doing that so that states could choose to do it. Basically, every state in the Union now has some type of prohibition against a state from doing that anyway. My own state has in its Constitution and in its Statehood Enabling Act explicit prohibitions against establishing a state church. So it's not as though any state in the Union today would ever go back to this point. So that's point one. Point two is, I think we have to always be mindful of the fact that there are a couple of different types of discrimination that can take place in a society, whether that discrimination is geared toward people of different sexes, different religious beliefs, different ethnicities, or otherwise. One occurs between citizen and citizen. The other occurs between government and citizen. They can both be bad, they can both be devastating, but the type of discrimination that occurs between government and citizen is particularly pernicious. You might be able to avoid a neighbor or even a would-be employer who chooses to mistreat people on the basis of their religious belief. You can't really avoid your government if it decides to subject you to disparate, unfair, cruel treatment as a result of your religious belief. So we've got to pay special attention to instances where the government threatens to treat people badly as a result of their religious belief. And that's one of the reasons why I've drafted legislation making sure that that can't happen. I put together a piece of legislation called the First Amendment Defense Act that says something very simple, which is that no individual and no group of individuals may receive adverse treatment by the government on the basis of a religious belief about what the definition of marriage is. That is, whether you view marriage as an institution only between a man and a woman or otherwise. That's your choice. Whether you're part of a church that performs only gay marriages or only marriages between a man and a woman or a combination of the two. That's none of the government's business. And your church should never suffer any adverse tax consequence from that. Its members should never be punished as a result of that. I think we need legislation like that, making clear that that is the worst kind of religious bigotry that exists.
I mean, if I may just focus on this bill or this approach for just a moment, what do you say in response to those who would say that what your bill does is actually punish the people who would be discriminated against on the basis of someone's religious beliefs, right? What do you do about the case of the couple that wants the wedding cake, or or this would protect the baker that doesn't want to bake a wedding cake for a same-sex wedding, but what about the couple that wants to be married?
Yeah, in the first place, I can't really fathom the scenario in which this would apply to the cake baker, because we're talking here about federal law, about actions taken by the federal government. The cake baker scenarios, which I'd love to get into later if you want to talk about those separately, those are typically under state law. As the Colorado case before the Supreme Court, that involved a state civil rights commission stepping in under state law. I can't fathom a scenario in which federal law would have an application to a cake baker in that type of circumstance. The second layer of answer there is that this bill is ambidextrous in that it treats the church recognizing same-sex marriage and the church not performing same-sex marriage equally. It guarantees that now and in the future, no church or no religious believer or group of believers can be subjected to any kind of adverse government decision based on what their belief about marriage happens to be. This ought to be welcomed by those who are advocates of same-sex marriage because this would protect them too.
Rabbi Soloveitchik, on the sort of the big picture question about what should be done right now in terms of reform, what thoughts do you have?
Yes, I think, just to build on the senator's points, it used to be that it was the Establishment Clause that was being used to push religion out of the public square. But now we've reached an even more worrisome or pernicious point, which is that now people are using are even speaking of using the tools of the government to come after the ability of religious institutions to just function and to produce adherents of their faith. So
Such as?
So the most for any member of the clergy within any more traditional faith, the most terrifying statement to be said in the Supreme Court in decades maybe was when Solicitor General Varelli under the Obama administration was asked by Justice Alito during the Obergefell, the same-sex marriage case, what would you say about a traditional religious organization that does not, that believes in the traditional approach to marriage? Do you think they are going to end up being penalized by the IRS the way Bob Jones University was, so that then so that now you would redefine any religious organization with a traditional approach to marriage as a bigoted organization? And just from an advocacy perspective, the right thing would have been to say, oh no, we just want to achieve this constitutional ruling, etc. But instead, almost as if he couldn't help himself, he says, that's a very good question, Justice Alito. And what that basically says is, I don't think the United States would ever become a place where a priest or a rabbi would be dragged to prison for what they believe about marriage. But if you can use the tools of the IRS or the federal government to shut down the tax-exempt status of a religious organization, that can help end basically traditional religious organizations in America. We couldn't function, and so that was really an incredibly frightening thing, and that's the great threat right now to religious thriving in America.
Please.
I was there in the courtroom that day when that happened, and I was also stunned by Solicitor General Varelli's response, where he said not only that, but he said that's going to be a problem, Justice Alito. We don't dispute that. It's going to be a problem. It's going to be a problem. The fact that he said it that boldly and repeated it 3 times, to me, signaled something. And that was about the time I realized, I had been thinking about it since the previous summer and when a different ruling came out from the Supreme Court. But that's when I realized it's time to push forward something like what became the First Amendment Defense Act. And I later received a similar answer when I asked the IRS commissioner at the time whether he agreed with that, and he said basically yes, that's going to become an issue at some point.
So that the great tragedy would be is if the particular political moment passes where the party makeup in government right now could actually do something about it to enshrine it, because political makeups change. Maybe you haven't noticed, but unexpected moments could happen in elections all the time. That would be a real tragedy if nothing is done and then to protect religious communities in the future, because other people will be in power at different points.
Well, Senator Lee's going to have to go back to Capitol Hill in just a little bit. We have about a little bit more than 10 minutes of your time left. I would like to open the floor to some audience questions. If anybody in the audience would like to ask a question before Senator Lee goes, then we'll continue the conversation with Rabbi Soloveitchik. We'll start here. There's a microphone coming, sir, and then in the third row.
This is rather refreshing because last night I was at the D.C. Jewish Community Center. Thankfully, there were only about maybe 20 people there, where 2 people discussed the ending of white Christian America, and it was among the most, I felt, anti-religious statement, discussion I had ever heard, and I really just had to squirrel myself away because I know what would have happened if I asked the question. But I was thinking back to thinking back to the Declaration of Independence and the idea of the importance of religion itself, and oh, by the way, and a week later, at my synagogue, the American Civil Liberties Union attorney was talking, and that was another wrenching experience. What kind of question do you ask without sounding too combative, without sounding too really offending everybody, although I probably would regardless of what I did?
Wait, so what's the question?
I'm asking for what kind of question would you ask in a situation where somebody talks about, I got up and said, well, what about the cake baking institution? And he went into this whole thing about what argument they made before the court on cake baking. And I just couldn't figure out what general thing to say about, you know, what would you say in that kind of audience, admittedly a hostile audience?
Yep. I'd start with a basic question about whether we want to live in a country in which an individual can be punished by the government on the basis of his or her religious beliefs. Here, his or her religious beliefs about marriage. And would you really want even to set a precedent that such a punishment could take place? We live in a country right now where there is no inclination to punish any religious belief or group of believers. Yes, in other words, when they bring up the Loving versus Virginia argument. Look, there is a long tradition in this country rooted deeply in federalism of allowing states to make decisions about marriage and family law. The Supreme Court of the United States intervened in Loving versus Virginia to end the prohibition against interracial dating as contrary to the Equal Protection Clause. The Equal Protection Clause was adopted for the specific purpose of ending disparate government treatment on the basis of race, and was motivated principally in that circumstance by an understanding that black Americans and white Americans had been treated very, very differently by a number of states. This was the natural outgrowth of that. The institution of marriage, by contrast, is something vastly different than that. It has its origins in thousands of years of history, not just in the Judeo-Christian tradition, but in the history of the earth. There is nothing in the Equal Protection Clause that necessarily compelled the decision in Obergefell for the Supreme Court to wade into this. That being said, that decision is made, and I'm not sure how much good that does for us to revisit that. But I do think that now that Obergefell is on the books, we need to avoid the Bob Jonesification of this area of the law, meaning the federal government was able to remove the tax-exempt status of a religious university based on a religious belief at the time, a religious teaching embodied in a student policy prohibiting students from dating members of other races. And it was not a defense that the Supreme Court was willing to accept, that this was rooted in a bona fide religious belief. So that's what I worry about, is taking that principle and applying it to Obergefell. The Bob Jonesification of the area in this law could subject many, if not most, churches and synagogues in the United States to a loss of their tax-exempt status, among other things, if the same principle is carried out there.
Hi, Paul Kamenar, and I'm one of the 12 who did read your book, Senator Lee, and I recommend it to everybody. Just a quick comment and a question. Talking about the religious test issue, et cetera, I recall back in the Reagan days where I knew your father, and where you had another level of that where the American Bar Association, and we have it documented, we're asking Reagan nominees, why do you send your children to a private Christian school? So they would use that before they recommended to the White House whether this judge nominee should be up or down. So there was another sinister way of the way this was happening, not only the public way that you mentioned. Thankfully, the ABA is now sort of out of the picture. They don't have that preferential thing. But my question then is basically, I'd like to maybe get your take on how do you think the cake baking case may come out, and to the rabbi, in terms of the Establishment Clause issue, we have that where the religion is being taken out of the public square in terms of what you think about this, things like school vouchers or providing, say, playground safety equipment to a private school where you have the one saying, oh, wait a minute, we need separation of church and state. So how do you think that will play out? Thank you.
Okay, the first part of the question.
Well, what do you think about the cake baking case? Even though it's a state law, there's a question whether or not that violates the free exercise clause of the cake baker.
My own belief is that the cake baker case involving Jack Phillips in Colorado is and will be decided as a compelled speech case. In other words, this is not a simple application of a public accommodation law. The cake baker in that case was not excluding clientele on the basis of sexual orientation as a categorical matter. In other words, anyone could come in off the street regardless of sexual orientation or any other status and purchase anything they wanted in the store. What Jack Phillips was objecting to was having to lend his own creative talent to a specific product that was geared specifically toward this particular same-sex couple, and that it is therefore a form of compelled speech. This one is therefore different than the standard garden variety application of a public accommodations law. Just as I could not compel Bono to come and perform at a Mike Lee campaign event, as much fun as that would be, under U.S. law, I'm not aware of any way that I could do that. The decision on the part of a person to speak affirmatively on behalf of something is particularized, and that's what you're being asked to do when you put your artistic talent into something specific for a particular cause.
Probably the cake case will be decided on that as well. I think that's right. It does raise the interesting question, just to get to the other establishment cases that you've raised, of the one thing that does give me hope is on a lot of these cases is that now we now have justices on the Supreme Court who actually think in an incredibly, both Justice Gorsuch and Alito, who think in an incredibly sophisticated way about these religious cases. Some of Alito's both dissents and opinions about religion have been just incredible to read. And so you mentioned some of the cases like federal funding and vouchers, et cetera. I'm on the board of the Beckett Fund, which is, I think, the best religious liberty law firm in the United States, and they've done incredible work on the playground case. They've done work on the current issue of FEMA aid to religious organizations as well. And so you do see changes at the administrative level. What I'm interested in is whether, and it may take one other seat replacement on the Supreme Court for this, but I'm wondering if cases like the cake case and others, which are now being decided on free speech grounds, and rightly so, whether we might reach a point where we could actually have a bigger religious freedom case that would enshrine religious freedom back in its rightful place in American jurisprudence. And that's, so to just mention one provocative point perhaps, and as I also revere the legacy of Justice Scalia, but if the one case that he famously wrote that most people who care about religious liberty do not like, which is Employment Division versus Smith, I wonder whether people who also revere his memory, such as a Justice Alito or a Justice Gorsuch, would write the same opinion. And if that case actually might be overturned, and you would further enshrine individual liberty on religious freedom issues, both against federal laws and against the general applicability of state laws as well. I think that might be one of the best things that could happen for the future of American religious freedom. I would just add one final point, which is that when people ask me questions about, well, what do you say when people describe religious people as bigots or other things like that? The point of the liberties of the United States are to actually protect groups that are not in line with the general zeitgeist. That's the whole point of these freedoms. And it used to be that to explain that, I would say, well, look, surely you're in favor of free speech for people with whom you disagree. So why would you not be in favor of religious liberty for people with whom you disagree? That's also part of the First Amendment. Unfortunately, free speech rights are not taken for granted in the American zeitgeist today either, all the time. So it's not necessarily the best argument you could put forward.
And I have to just add one point on the Masterpiece Cake Shop case. One of the interesting things at oral argument was the way Justice Kennedy was really zeroing in on explicit statements from at least one of the commissioners in Colorado that was overt hostility. It'll be interesting if he ends up writing an opinion that sort of protects against overt hostility, but leaves the door open to sort of unspoken, off-the-record hostility that's embodied in the decision. But Senator Lee, we're up on your time. Do you have any thoughts in closing? We appreciate your time so much. If you have any points you want to make before you go.
Yeah, sure. First of all, thank you for letting me join you today. It really is a pleasure to be here. And I want to say that one of the many ways in which Latter-day Saints like myself feel a kinship with the Jewish people is the fact that although ours has been on a much smaller scale and for a much shorter period of time, our church was founded in 1830, the LDS people feel a lot of kinship with our Jewish brothers and sisters because we too have faced on our own smaller scale religious persecution. The church was founded in upstate New York. They regarded us as heretics there. They shot at us. So we moved to Kirtland, Ohio. They regarded us as heretics there. They shot at us. So we moved to Jackson County, Missouri. Then on October 27, 1837, the governor of Missouri, Lilburn Boggs, ordered us exterminated. Actual words he used in an executive order, which remained in place until about 30 years ago, when then Governor Kit Bond decided it was time to rescind that order. We left Missouri, went to a town called Nauvoo, Illinois, and in Nauvoo, Illinois, they regarded us as heretics. They shot at us. They killed our church founder and prophet, Joseph Smith. So we left. We went to what was then sort of northern unincorporated Mexico, settled in a dry, cold desert in a valley inhabited by exactly 2 trees. There was a large saltwater lake joined by a smaller freshwater lake with a river that we appropriately named Jordan. And it is reminiscent in some small ways of some of the persecution endured in the case of Jewish people, not just by a couple of centuries, but by many millennia. And so Jewish people throughout the world and Mormons throughout the world feel this special kinship and regard ourselves as partners in a lifelong pursuit to make sure that religious freedom is protected. There are, in fact, threats to religious freedom in America today. They are all around us. The fact that we have a current member of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission who has herself stated emphatically that when religious freedom and sexual liberty come into conflict, sexual liberty has to win, basically every time. The fact that that person has been renominated for another 5-year term is itself distressing, and that other comments made by that same commissioner, Jai Feldblum, that is concerning to me. The more we allow this kind of sentiment to build within our government, and the more we allow the expression of religious belief to be relegated to church pews, to the inside of a synagogue, to private spaces, and we disqualify the legitimacy of religious viewpoints, the more religious freedom is going to suffer. When religious freedom suffers, inevitably other rights will follow. And so I'd like to close by quoting something that George Washington said to our friend and our hero, Jonas Phillips, in response to his letter that he received while he was at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia and had just adopted the religious test clause. He wrote back and he noted that, let's see, yeah, I lost the quote. It was brilliant. George Washington quoted the book of Micah. He said that America is a country where, quote, everyone shall sit safely under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid. That's from Micah 4:4. This is what I'm talking about. When we protect religious freedom, other freedoms are protected likewise. They go hand in hand. They are inextricably intertwined. human flourishing may occur when a people are allowed to be free and believe and worship or choose not to worship Almighty God as they choose. I personally believe that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob lives. He is aware of us, each and every one of us. He is aware of every forest in our trees. He is aware of every hair that falls from our heads. He wants the sons and the daughters of the United States of America to live in freedom. That's my hope, and that's my life's work. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Senator. Thank you very much. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. So while Senator Lee is going to head back to Capitol Hill now, we would like to take a few more minutes to talk with Rabbi Soloveitchik about his research on these issues and the course he's teaching for the Tikva Fund. I don't know if Jonathan Silver, do you have your microphone yet, Jonathan? Well, why don't we start the video? There's a video next to you, a brief montage of clips from your course that you're teaching right now on Judaism and the American founding, and then we'll be joined by Jonathan Silver.
Jews here have never had it. Here you have someone who's a friend of the Founding Father. He's wealthy, he's accepted, he's embraced. The only thing he can't do is serve in the legislature while retaining his fealty to Judaism. So what?
Paine advances this argument in the name of the Hebrew Bible. Why does an old infidel like Thomas Paine do that?
Now that they have engaged in this great revolution, what should be the symbol of their cause and of this new nation?
We're going to go to a wedding. Tell us about it.
And in fact, as we shall see, he became the first advocate for religious liberty in this new nation. He is the most important American Jew that many of you have never heard. Your miraculous story is parallel to ours. Imagine receiving one from the head of a new nation. There is a Jewish grave on the estate of the third president of the United States. We know very little about the woman who was buried there, but we know a great deal about her father, Jonas Phillips, and about her son, Commodore Uriah Phillips Lang. And we will be using the saga of the Phillips family as a lens by which to see both the extraordinary and unique nature of the Jewish experience in America, as well as the impact of Jewish ideas on America's founding.
Great. Wonderful. Well, we're being joined now by my friend Jonathan Silver. Jonathan's Senior Director of the Tikva Fund, where he hosts the Tikva podcast on great Jewish essays and ideas. I highly recommend it, actually. It's a great podcast. He also leads Tikva's library on online courses and oversees a range of educational programs and publishing ventures. He was educated at Tufts University, the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and he holds a PhD from the Department of Government at Georgetown University. So, Rabbi Soloveitchik, would you tell us a little bit about this course you're teaching on Jews and the American founding, or Jewish ideas in the American founding?
So this course is a series of 8 lectures that uses the story of the Phillips family to tell 2 different but parallel stories that are intertwined. One is the uniquely American version of religious freedom that Jews found in America, and simultaneously we tell the story of the unique impact that the Hebrew Bible had on America's founders and America's founding.
Well, we've talked a little bit about Jonas Phillips and his family, but on that second point, actually,
Yeah.
I'd be interested in hearing more, especially, but if you could tell us a little bit more about what you discuss in the course.
Sure. So one of the lectures is about what really happened on July 4th, meaning I'm a John Adams file, I guess you would say, and I'm, like him, very sensitive about Jefferson getting too much credit and not him getting enough credit. And John Adams' original plan was that we celebrate American independence on July 2nd, because that was when they voted on the Lee Resolution to actually break off from the British colony. Yeah. And, you know, Adams has a letter to Abigail where he says, July 2nd, which I've achieved, you know, will be celebrated with fireworks, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And he didn't know that everyone was just going to focus on Jefferson's declaration. Yeah. But on July 4th, what really happened, this is July 4th revisionism, what really happened on July 4th is that after approving the declaration, the Continental Congress formed a committee to decide a seal of the United States. Mm-hmm. And that committee was Franklin, Adams, and Jefferson. And Franklin's suggestion for the seal of the United States was an image of Moses and Pharaoh at the sea with the motto, "Rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God." And Jefferson himself, really one of the more secular of the founders, also chose an Exodus image of Israel in the desert, following a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. So you have this theme of how the Hebrew Bible figures into the rhetoric and even the metaphysic of the American founding. And that's linked to the fact that Jews found such a welcome home in America.
And so tell us about the course then.
Yeah.
What do you teach over the
So what we'll do is
series.
we'll do a series of 8 lectures and that will weave the story of Jonas Phillips to the wedding that Benjamin Rush attends, meaning his own life, the wedding of his daughter that Benjamin Rush attends, 2 of his remarkable grandchildren. One is Uriah Phillips Levy. The other one is Mordecai Manuel Noah, the first Jew to receive a prominent federal appointment in the Madison administration. And along the way, while you're meeting these Jewish figures, you're also meeting the founders that these Jews knew, or the founders whose legacy these Jews ended up preserving and bequeathing to the American people. So you're meeting Washington as he's writing letters to the Jewish community after he becomes president. You're seeing the 2 different parts of the story, the Jewish community and the founders come together when Jonas Phillips' spiritual leader and rabbi participates in the inauguration of George Washington at Federal Hall in New York. You're at the Continental Congress when they're discussing what biblical image should represent the United States until they scratch all those cool ideas and instead give us the creepy pyramid with the eye on it as the seal of the United States. So the 2 weave together so that these 2 stories end up being told really together and simultaneously.
Now, this isn't the first online course that Tikva has done. Yeah. The first was Ruth Weiss, right, on the novel
Daniel Deronda, right.
What spurred you and your colleagues to design this particular course and focus on this issue at this time?
This is actually, it goes to a much deeper point to complement the conversation that we listened to with Senator Lee. I think Tikva's conceit in trying to pioneer these courses is that just as federal legislation should be advanced to protect religious freedom, there has to be, in parallel to complement that, a major educational effort to try to touch and describe and bolster the deeper fundaments of belief for why religious freedom is important. Tikva is dedicated to Jewish excellence in the modern age, and we go about that work in part by hosting online courses, but in part by doing live in-person educational programs. Our theory for these online courses is really twofold. One, Rabbi Soloveitchik for many years has been writing and teaching and speaking in congregations and in public fora about Jewish ideas and the American founders. We wanted to try to bring that together in a way that will survive for many, many years into the future. Something that will educate not only people who enroll in the course now, but both my children and Rabbi Soloveitchik's children, something which is enduring beyond Rabbi Soloveitchik's current activity. The other thing is that Professor Weiss is a great example. Professor Weiss has been teaching this novel, Daniel Deronda, for many years at Harvard University. When she retired, she's not going to teach that book again. And so there's an archival quality to trying to capture the best of Jewish leaders, Jewish intellectuals, Jewish thinkers, and preserving them is something which is an enduring cultural legacy too.
I mean, obviously you created this course to fill a gap in modern education and in modern public square. Why do you think it is that we've reached a point where a course like this is necessary? What sort of social or political trajectory has brought us to a point where we need to be reminded about these things?
I mean, for my sins, I come out of academic political science, and that community.
I'm a lawyer, it could be worse.
That community for many years has been invested in the project of trying to understand the American founding on more or less secular grounds. And there was a kind of consensus view advanced by Louis Hartz many years ago, the liberal tradition in America, which made the case that the American founding and the American tradition is primarily an outworking of Enlightenment and liberal philosophers. I think that served political purposes at the time of the Cold War, but I just think it's not true. And when you actually look at the evidence, as Rabbi Soloveitchik does in this course, you see a much more sophisticated amalgam of philosophical and religious traditions coming together in the founding.
Rabbi, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not making the case in the course, right, that Judaism was the only source of the American founding. That would be amazing if I could, but I can't go that far. But what we do make the case in the course is that the political DNA of America is a sort of double helix of, yes, Enlightenment philosophy, but also biblical ideas. And that those two together is what makes America unique and different from other modern republics or other constitutional democracies. And in that respect, the Jewish story it both has a great deal to say about it because the Hebrew Bible plays such a strong role, and also because the experience of the few Jews who were in America at that time highlights and reifies what was unique about the American founding.
So, earlier in our conversation with Senator Lee, I referred both to the views of religious belief in government, but then also in the public square.
Yeah.
Right, and we focus more on the government issues, but for me, I'm constantly sort of intrigued by the way in which religion and religious belief is viewed in the public square. It's not by government pushing something, but just socially, right? I mean, Father Richard John Newhouse, famously created First Things magazine in part to draw attention to the way religion and religious belief was discussed in the public square, and so I'd just be curious what your thoughts are on where that project stands, how what you're working on speaks to not just what's happening in government, but how we think about these things among private citizens in the public square.
Yeah, so obviously, as Newhouse noted, when the Naked Public Square was published, which was, how many decades ago was that, actually?
30 years ago.
Yeah, so 30 years ago was when he was first noticed around. We've obviously come in a very long way, and not really in a good way, on these issues. There is an underlying story to it, which is actually part of what also this course gets at, which is that, as others have noted, like Elliot Abrams in his book Faith or Fear, about the Jewish experience in the 1950s, 1960s in America, many American Jews in the 20th century, actually, and certain Jewish organizations assumed that Jews would be better off in an America where faith was banished from the public square. And not only, I think, is that untrue to the experience of early American Jews, but also it happens to be that those who are more comfortable, Jews who are more comfortable with, by and large, I don't want this to speak in generalizations, but Jews who are more comfortable with traditional faith in general in their own lives are more comfortable with that faith, that the faith of others being highlighted in the public square as well. But we're in a place now where things are very different, and this gives a snapshot of a very different sort of America. On the other hand, America still remains a republic where speaking about faith is in public is still more part of the norm than countries, say, in Europe. Sure. Justice Scalia, who we've been talking a lot about recently, just now, has a famous story that he was in Europe on 9/11, 2001, for a jurisprudence conference, and they all gathered around the TV watching President Bush speak, and he said that he was struck that a European judge who was watching the address with him was struck by how President Bush would end off by speaking about faith and by saying, "God bless America." And this judge said that no one in Europe would ever end off that way. I used to hear from Rabbi Sachs, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, the former friend of mine, the former chief rabbi of England, that he used to meet with Tony Blair, who was actually quite religious, to study Bible, but they would keep it secret because that was not something that prime ministers were supposed to do. Alistair Campbell, Prime Minister Blair's spokesman, when asked about Blair's faith, said, "We don't do God," is what he said. So that's, even as the Establishment Clause is really been applied in some very new and overly creative ways today, America still remains a country where faith plays a public role unlike anywhere else in Europe. That aspect of it is still there.
Now, to be fair to the European judge, it would be strange if European officials ended their speeches with "God bless America."
Right, exactly.
General point.
That's like the Gorbachev, the Reagan joke, right? Where Reagan said to Gorbachev, you know, in America, anyone can come into the Oval Office and say, I don't like the way Ronald Reagan is running the country. And Gorbachev said, sure. Anyone in Russia can also come into the Kremlin and say, I don't like the way Ronald Reagan is running the country. Yeah.
John, do you have any thoughts on this?
Just that, you know, at the founding generation saw Republican government as requiring a moral citizenry. And in order to form the moral horizons of American citizens, religion has always played an indispensable part. I think what we're trying to do in this course, and indeed in all of TICVA's publications and educational programs, is in the very narrow community in which we live and work, in the Jewish community in America, is to try to remind Jews of the responsibilities they have to try to bring their moral imagination into the public square.
Well, we have a few minutes left. If anybody has any further questions for Rabbi Soloveitchik or for Jonathan Silver, I'd be happy to take them before we break.
Hi. Forgive me if my question's a little long-winded, but I'll try. So we just talked a little bit about like religion in Europe. You alluded to something like on 9/11. Can you talk to me about how you think through religious freedom and separation of church and state and the difference between what we have here in the United States and Europe? So that's the first part, and I'll do an obnoxious two-part question. But the second part of that is what we've seen in Western Europe is troubling to me in terms of how they think of religious freedom and when people's core values and ways of seeing the world are frankly antithetical to Western values. And can you, does my question make sense? Can you just talk about that a little bit? It's a problem.
Yeah. Two-part question is not obnoxious at all. I mean, I go to Jewish events where most questions are not even questions. So
yeah, and that was not long-winded.
Yeah, I mean, two-part. I'd give anything for a two-part question usually. So that's fantastic. Thank you. Start from the second one, and then maybe you can remind me of the first. So on the second one, what we have in Europe today is a very strange situation. You know, when the European Union first drafted its constitution, right, as the Pope at the time pointed out, right, no mention was even made of the impact of Christianity on Western civilization. So you have basically the approach of Europe to faith right now is going hand in hand with a strange situation in which Europe is deliberately forgetting who it is, what it is, what is Western civilization. That doesn't mean Christianity was the only serious set of ideas that helped bring what we call the West into being, but it certainly undeniably played a pretty significant role. But that's been lost, you know. So, and that I think has to go hand in hand with the dangers to religious freedom today. So I mentioned my friend Rabbi Sachs. It's both wonderful and strange, meaning it's wonderful and a source of pride to me, but strange in general, that a rabbi is basically becoming, you know, becomes famous for being the most public voice of faith in much of Europe, reminding Europe who it is and what it is, and speaking about things like why Europe is forgetting about the role faith played in its founding, why Europe has stopped having children, and so on and so forth. So this is part, and then when you put that together with what goes on in Europe on religious liberty issues, you know, where Rabbi Sachs visited Amsterdam, the Netherlands, and said, well, really my community, the Spanish-Portuguese synagogue, was born, essentially. It was the first haven of religious liberty in Europe, period. And what he said there was, you know, the Netherlands is where religious liberty was born. Don't let it be the place where it dies. So those two phenomena go together, I think, in Europe. So that's where we are. It's a much larger issue. It's not that Europe is taking a new approach to religious freedom. It's that Europe is forgetting, actually, what its identity is, or deliberately amputating
a part of its identity from itself.
Right. So there's both separation of church and state, what that means, where it's from, where the actual origin of that phrase is even. Right. I mean, these are huge and important questions. But suffice it to say that the American, and what this lecture series highlights, is that part and parcel of the religious liberty story of Jews in America, which is the story of the religious liberty of many different sects and denominations in America, is the fact that America was both comfortable with religion being in the public square, but also it being out there in, to use a word they would not have used then, in a pluralistic fashion. So one of the stories we have here is there was during the debate over the ratification of the Constitution, they had a parade in Philadelphia celebrating the fact that Pennsylvania had voted to ratify the Constitution. And Benjamin Rush was there. And he notes that there was and his words are something like, at the parade he sees a rabbi of the Jews walking arm in arm with a minister in the parade. And he says that this is a most delightful sight. There can be no better symbol of our new Constitution, meaning which has no religious test for office than this. So you have that, they're walking arm in arm. And then, and this I quote from a recollection of a 95-year-old Jew who's Jonas Phillips' son, who's writing, I think after the Civil War, who was there at this parade in 1787 as a young man. And he recalls that after the parade, there's food, and there's a separate kosher table with soused salmon, which is basically lox, at this thing. So it's amazing for several reasons. It's amazing, first of all, because this 95-year-old Jew remembers first and foremost the food that was at this event. But beyond that, you can't imagine that happening anywhere else in the world. You have the rabbi and the minister walking together, and then there's a separate kosher table, and people are comfortable with the fact that they're separate also. The big theme that comes a lot throughout these lectures is that the American model of religious freedom is that people of faith can be both strangers and neighbors in society. That's what Abraham says about himself. I am a stranger and a neighbor among you. That you could be that simultaneously. Jonas Phillips, in his letter to Washington, puts the Hebrew and the American date on the letter. I mean, who's he writing this to? I mean, he's not right. There are no Jews in the Constitutional Convention, but he's boldly writing. He writes 24 Elul 55, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. Then he's like, if you want the Goyish date, here, it's also 1787. Why is he doing this? He's saying, because at the heart of the American idea of religious liberty is that I could be both Jew and American simultaneously, both stranger and neighbor simultaneously. And that's what you see unfolding. But none of these things are happening in Europe at the time. And to some extent, Europe is still the French model is incredibly uncomfortable with diverse religious displays in the public square. So in the story of the Jews, you actually see what is unique about the American version of both religious liberty, but also of diverse religious displays in the public square. And both aspects, we've lost our notion, to some extent, of what they once were.
Yeah, Europe seems to be approaching religion almost with a don't ask, don't tell policy at this point.
Yeah, I mean, it sort of alternates. I mean, you have two different, you have that or the extreme. In other words, that there's it's either all secular public square, or because they're worried about things like Islamic fundamentalism, which I'm not saying is not a concern, but they'll say, okay, now that therefore we'll crack down on ritual slaughter, and then they'll ban kosher slaughter, halal slaughter. They'll ban the people will talk about banning circumcision. So it's almost that they haven't found any way to negotiate a middle ground in talking about these very important subjects.
There was a question over here in the second row. There's a microphone coming behind you. This will be the last question.
I'm curious as to whether part of your project at the Tikva Fund, or just generally what you're both addressing here, will address the question of, I think, a growing ignorance in sort of the chattering classes about what the nature of faith itself is. Because when you hear the discussions, it's usually approached with the idea of religion is something you do, which I think is fundamentally wrong, which leads to all sorts of free exercise errors. Because if you're thinking of religion as something you can do or not do, as opposed to something you are, you come to very different answers on these legal questions.
Yeah. John, do you want to have a lot to say on this, but maybe you go first.
Let me actually, let me just, before I address that, let me just say a word about the European case. Sure. I'm not going to remember because I don't come from the legal tradition, I don't remember the details of the case precisely. But about 10 years ago or so, there was a case brought in an Italian court which was questioning the ability for a cross to be hung in a state school. And this rose to a high appellate level in the European Union. The solicitor who argued in the name of allowing the cross to remain hung in the school, a gentleman who's a friend and sometimes teacher at Tikva, a gentleman named Joseph Weiler, is an Orthodox Jew arguing for the cross to remain in the state-sponsored Italian school. It seems to me that's actually an incredible model that we should remember. Yeah. And one of the things that most struck me working with Rabbi Soloveitchik on this course is actually the call to action that it offers. Jewish Americans need to work with Christian Americans and see that whereas there have been times in the past when the Jewish community has been uniquely threatened on religious liberty issues, it's actually now, in many cases, Christian Americans who are out front, on the front lines of religious liberty threats. And I think that one of the things I take from this course and this whole experience is the call that Jews have, the responsibility Jews have to stand with them, something that threatens both of us together.
I think that's exactly right. I think that part of the case we're making here is that the Jews have, precisely because of the extraordinary religious freedom that they found here, are obligated to ensure that that religious freedom is available to others, even when specific issues don't threaten them. That's why I testified in Congress on the healthcare mandate issue, not because I thought during the Obamacare debates, not because I thought that Jewish institutions were going to be particularly affected by that, but because I thought it was the Jewish obligation to speak out for that. To your question, I think you're exactly right. There's actually two different aspects of lack of knowledge that we're addressing here. One is lack of knowledge among many today about the aspect of faith. That's what you're addressing. Yuval Levin, I think somewhere said that the original American concept of religious freedom is not the freedom to do what you want, it's the freedom to do what you must. Mm-hmm. Meaning, we are all, religious citizens are, as like the Thomas More line in A Man for All Seasons, I die the king's loyal servant, but God's first. Mm-hmm. Right, so we're not the king's loyal servant here in America, don't misunderstand me. But we don't have a king, but thanks in part to the Hebrew Bible, but in the Revolution, but the fact is, the notion of faith is not just something that we really like. It's not just an elective thing. Faith means, exactly as you say, it brings with it the notion that these are the things that we must do, no matter the consequences. And therefore, because of that, people like Madison sought to create a country where people could obey the dictates of their beliefs without being penalized. At the same time, action is also a part of faith, meaning we can't do away with that. It's not just about belief, hardcore belief, which it is, but your beliefs translate into how you act in the world, and protecting that is also part of American liberty. How you act as a doctor, who's also a person of faith. How you act as a business, like in Hobby Lobby, that you're creating as a person of faith. Those things also need to be protected. So, but you're absolutely right that talking about what faith is an important part. The other thing that I think we're seeking to teach in this course is that there's a lot of lack of knowledge about American history. Mm-hmm. People don't know a lot of the stories that we're telling. There have been those who have noted, who have written about some of these subjects, that the story of Franklin and Jefferson and the seal is in very few biographies of Jefferson. The fact that it was the religious test for office clause in the Constitution that Jews saw as the great symbol of American equality, not the First Amendment. People don't know anything about that. People have people do not know enough about what is actually at the heart of the ideas at the heart of the American founding. So this is both a course in the incredible and little-known story of the Jewish experience in America in the earliest times, and it's also a course in the extraordinary nature of American civics. I think the best way to capture it, if I can quote the greatest philosopher and theologian of our age, which is, of course, Yogi Berra. When Yogi Berra was told that the mayor of Dublin, Ireland, is Jewish, he said, the mayor of Dublin is Jewish only in America, right? Okay? And that's really what we're trying to showcase here, which is what is unique about the American idea, about the experience, and about the experience of religious communities in America. And the incredible story of the Jews in this tale tells a story that is important, we think, not just for Jews, but for all Americans. And one of the things I'm gratified by, to end with John's point as well, is how positively religious Christians have responded to, and as you've seen from Senator Lee's speech about Jonas Phillips, how positively people of faith in America, throughout America, have responded to the story we're trying to tell.
Right. Well, this morning's conversation with Rabbi Soloveitchik, John, Senator Lee, is part of an ongoing, almost monthly series we have here in the D.C. office of the Hoover Institution called Opening Arguments, Conversations on American Constitutionalism, where we try to take a look at different aspects of how we govern ourselves. The next installment will be on March 7th. It'll be Senator Grassley here talking about his view of Congress and Congress's proper powers and obligations. And so he'll speak. It's a morning event, so then he can get back to the Hill, and then we'll be followed by a panel discussion with the aforementioned Yuval Levin and some others. So I hope you'll join us then. But in the meantime, thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you very much to our speakers. Thank you.